this family, 5 in number, was the work of a moment. There was a little infant sleeping in a cradle that was forgotten until we had left the house and gone some distance when Henry and Will returned and killed it.
Over the next 24 hours, Nat Turner led a small group of slaves from farm to farm, killing every white man, woman, and child they encountered. They gathered guns and more recruits during a brief but bloody revolt that spread terror throughout the slave-holding South. Nat Turner was captured and hanged. In the days before his execution, he agreed to tell his story.
You must surely bear it.
But after his death, his words became the property of others, as his body was during his life.
As though it were...
His story has been continually retold since 1831. He has been depicted as a great and inspiring hero and vilified as an insane fanatic. Each author possesses Nat Turner, transforming his identity and the meaning of his revolt. Although today we cannot clearly make out the face of the man, he continues to provoke a bitter debate over the violence that he inspired. For a nation unable to come to terms with the legacy of slavery, Nat Turner remains a troublesome property. Nat Turner's slave rebellion triggered a massive mobilization of local militia and vigilante units in Virginia and neighboring North Carolina. As many as 3,000 armed men were called into action to fight what turned out to be 60 to 80 rebels.
The balance of sheer military power was weighted tremendously against the slaves in this country. Slaves don't have the organization, the access to arms, the military tradition to be able to mobilize a successful insurrection.
Slavery itself was such an abomination that I could see how it would drive men and women to do desperate things. And a slave revolt, by its nature to me, is a pretty desperate act.
Outraged by the sight of the victims of the revolt, including many badly mutilated women and children, the militia and vigilante units engaged in a slaughter of their own.
The violent, brutal reaction is meant as a warning. It's meant to frighten those who might be contemplating acts like this in the future. It's meant to demonstrate the power of white society.
At least 50 and perhaps many more slaves and free blacks were summarily executed in the days after the suppression of the rebellion.
There's no question that there's a cult of violence that surrounds the tension between black and white during slavery times and after. It's hard for us to fathom cutting off people's heads and putting them on poles, parading them around, hanging bodies up in chains, dismembering the body, taking home souvenirs.
We know all about the victims, the white victims of Turner's Rebellion, who they were, where they were killed, what their names were, what their families were. Nobody knows the names of even all the participants in the Turner Rebellion, and certainly all the innocent blacks who were killed or imprisoned or beaten afterwards. This is not part of our official historical memory. That piece of the story is just forgotten or suppressed and probably can never really be completely recovered.
If a lot of those black people were not the property of white people, a lot more of them would be killed. Wasn't it Virginia law that said if you kill somebody's slave, the state had to reimburse them the cost of the slave or something like that?
Bailiff, will you approach, please?
Every rebel except Nat Turner was quickly killed or captured. During the month of September and on into October, nearly 50 accused rebels stood trial in Southampton County.
Stand up. guilty as charged. You shall be hanged by the neck until you are dead.
The prisoner is guilty. The court doth value the said slave to the sum of $425.
Ultimately, 19 were hanged, while others were transported and sold outside the boundaries of the state.
The court recommends to the governor that the punishment be commuted to transportation.
And still, Nat Turner remained at large. On September 17, 1831, Virginia Governor John Floyd issued a proclamation offering a $500 reward for the capture of Nat Turner.
Nat is between 30 and 35 years old, 5 feet 6 or 8 inches high, weighs between 150 and 160 pounds, rather bright complexion, but not a mulatto. Broad-shouldered, large flat nose, large eyes, broad flat feet, rather not...
Governor Floyd's description of Nat Turner is the closest thing we have to a portrait of the man. But it is nothing more than a wanted poster, created to help white men capture a fugitive. We do not know exactly what happened at the capture of Nat Turner, but a 19th century engraving offers one possible image of the moment. We do know it was not until October 30th, 70 days after the outbreak of the rebellion, that Benjamin Phipps stumbled on to Nat Turner's hiding place. The slave had never wandered further than a few miles from his home farm.
Come on out of there.
Steve and Dave use eToro to trade cryptocurrencies. Steve does extensive research.
You come on out of there now. Put it down. I said put it down.
The next morning, he was taken to the Southampton County Jail in Jerusalem to await trial. It was there in a jail cell that Nat Turner first encountered a local lawyer, Thomas R. Gray. Over the next 3 days, Gray interviewed Turner and then published his version of Turner's story, which later became the main source for all future interpretations of the man.
The late insurrection in Southampton greatly excited the public mind and led to thousands of idle, exaggerated, and mischievous reports. Everything connected to that sad affair was wrapped in mystery until Nat Turner, the leader of that ferocious band whose name resounded throughout our widely extended empire, was captured. Since his confinement, with permission of the jailer, I have had ready access to him and determined, for the gratification of public curiosity, to commit his statements to writing and to publish them with little or no variation to his own words.
Nobody can, I think, say precisely why Thomas R. Gray went into the jail cell on November the 1st, 1831. It could be that he just wanted the public to know. He felt the public had a right to know what Nat Turner had done from Nat Turner's own point of view. It could be that he sought prestige after a great drop in his own reputability by going in and making himself as famous as he could by being Nat Turner's amanuensis, taking down what he said. He could have been thinking of the income he might derive.
You have asked me to give you the history of the motives which induced me to undertake the late insurrection, as you call it. To do so, I must go back to the days of my infancy and even before I was born. I was 31 years of age on the 2nd October last, born the property of Benjamin Turner of this county. Being at play with other children when 3, 4 years old, I was telling them something, which my mother overhearing said it had happened before I was born. I stuck to my story, however, and related some things which went, in her opinion, to confirm it. Others being called on were greatly astonished, knowing that these things had happened, and caused them to say, in my hearing, I surely would be a prophet, as the Lord had shown me things that happened before my birth.
Many historians are not convinced that all, or even most of the words Gray attributes to Turner were actually spoken by him.
There is no Nat Turner back there whole to be retrieved. You'd have to go and create Nat Turner. And we have a very fragmented, disjointed narrative, which purports to be the Confessions. And there's the question of whose voice is there.
I do not believe for a moment that Nat Turner talked that way.
It is very clear by now that we cannot take Nat Turner's confessions at face value. But it is also very clear that we cannot cast it aside.
Gray's Confessions of Nat Turner creates a definite image of the man, but we can never be sure the face we see is that of Nat Turner.
I was praying one day at my plow. The Spirit spoke to me, saying, "Seek ye the kingdom of heaven, and all things shall be added unto you."
What do you mean by the Spirit?
The Spirit that spoke to the prophets in former days.
Nat Turner must have eaten up the Christian and Hebrew scriptures and must have begun to feel and see and sense himself as the embodiment of these.
The thunder rolled in the heavens, and blood flowed in streams. And I heard a voice saying, "Such is your luck. Such you are called. And let it come, rough or smooth, you must surely bear it." While laboring in the field, I discovered drops of blood on the corn, as though it were dew from heaven, and communicated it to many, both white and black in the neighborhood. And I then found on the leaves in the woods hieroglyphic characters and numbers, with the forms of men in different attitudes portrayed in blood and representing figures I had seen before in the heavens. And on the 12th of May, 1828, I heard a loud noise in the heavens, and the Spirit instantly appeared to me and said that the serpent was loosened, and that Christ had laid down the yoke he had borne for the sins of men, and that I should take it on and fight against the serpent. For the time was fast approaching when the first should be last and the last should be first.
Do you not find yourself mistaken now?
Was not Christ crucified?
Was not Christ crucified? That's an astonishing statement by a man who's chained to the wall. You're going to be hanged the next day. And he's told that all your comrades are hanged, that your wife has been sold south, that you'll be hanged tomorrow. And he stands up from the cut and he says, "Was not Christ crucified?" Can you imagine that? It's one of the great moments in human history, isn't it?
Any intelligent reader coming on the Confessions, the original Confessions of Nat Turner, and then reflects on those confessions for a while, would have to say to himself, this guy is a crazy lunatic. There's something really strange. The moment when he says to Mr. Gray, "Was not Christ crucified?"
The myths contradict each other, and they grow up. He's a saint. He's a crazy man. You get conflicting reports, and people repeat them. They get carried on, and the historian has to peel back through that onion and try to find the real historical person.
And until the first sign appeared, I should conceal it from the knowledge of man, and on the appearance of the sign,
the eclipse of the sun last February,
I should arise and prepare myself and slay my enemies with their own weapons. And until we had armed and equipped ourselves and gathered sufficient force, neither age nor sex was to be spared.
Which was invariably adhered to.
When people bring that argument to me that war, you kill people in war and you're trained, but that's declared. You know, this is my position now. That's declared. You give people the chance to know that I'm going to fight you or that I might kill you. These people were not given that opportunity.
Revolutions have to be thorough. You spare the kids, they run off and warn your enemies. If you're gonna take that road, you'd better make up.
Steve and Dave use eToro to trade cryptocurrencies. Steve does extensive research in order to find the next Bitcoin. Dave does research on how to become a level 60 wizard. Steve follows the feed for the latest crypto news. Dave follows the feed for the latest cat videos. Steve has a watch list for promising breakout coins. Dave has a watch list too. So why is Dave just as good a trader as Steve? It's because Dave used eToro's copy trader to automatically replicate Steve's trading activity. Whenever Steve makes a trade,
Your mind to take it to the end. That is the horror of the thing. I mean, it's all well and good to say that these killings came out of rage. I don't doubt that to a certain extent they did, but the real horror is that even if they hadn't, they would have. Matters would have probably taken the same course. A revolution is either thorough or it's doomed. Real revolutionaries know that, which is why they have to proceed in cold blood.
The murder of this family, 5 in number, was the work of a moment. There was a little infant sleeping in a cradle that was forgotten until we had left the house and gone some distance, when Henry and Will returned and killed it.
The killing of the women and children stick in my craw more than anything else. He would certainly be remembered better by history if he had limited the killing to adult males or white adults.
That evil that he saw was what was needed to be destroyed. And the only way to force the destruction of that evil was to make the price so high that those who was practicing slavery would eventually sue for peace and says, we cannot keep slavery because it will cost us too much.
The only thing I will say is slavery was so wrong, but murder is wrong too.
We started for Mrs. Reese's, where, finding the door unlocked, we entered and murdered Mrs. Reese in her bed while sleeping. Her son awoke, but had only time to say, "Who's that?" And he was no more.
I think that for many people, many white people, they identify with the innocents. They identify with innocent children. It's a position that's much more comfortable than identifying with slaveholders. And because that's a feature of the story, it makes it seem safe for people who know that they have to stand morally against slavery to say nonetheless that there was something morally wrong in the uprising.
I don't think his goal was to kill white children. His goal was to give freedom for his people. And if, way before Malcolm even said it, by any means necessary, and if that meant the killing of white children, so be it. And it was an uncompromising position, and I think it was based on something that he had seen around him, the killing of black children, the selling of black children. And it was reprehensible, but he, I understand why he did it.
Calm, deliberate composure with which he spoke of his late deeds and intention. expression on his fiend-like face when excited by enthusiasm, still bearing the stains of the blood of helpless innocents about him, clothed in rags, wrapped in chains, yet daring to raise his manacled hands to heaven with a spirit soaring above the attributes of man. I looked on him and my blood curdled in my veins. He's a complete fanatic, who he plays his part most admirably.
I was struck with the tug that Nat Turner had over him. And so I remember thinking, even as he was trying to present him as this figure, this misguided fanatic, as he called him, he was still fascinated with him, impressed by him in some way.
Over and over again, those who search for the meaning of Nat Turner begin their inquiry with a search for the meaning of the Confessions.
I see Turner's Confessions as our confessions of not really being quite sure who we are in relationship to each other, black and white in this country.
We know very little about the hanging of Nat Turner. The only contemporary account appeared in a local newspaper. And as with all Nat Turner stories, we are left with more questions than facts.
The record about Nat Turner is so ambiguous. We have so few facts, and yet he's at the center of such an enormous controversy that there's room for lots of different interpretations.
In 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe created a national debate on the morality of slavery with her novel Uncle Tom's Cabin. When she published Dread, A Tale of the Dismal Swamp in 1856, with the title character closely based on the historical Nat Turner, she confronted the question of ending slavery by violent means. But she could not embrace an uncompromising black man who was devoted to the death of all white people, and so she softened him considerably.
He was a tall black man of magnificent stature and proportions. He wore a fantastic turban. There were elements in him which might, under other circumstances, have made him a poet. There was in him a vein of that gentleness which softens the heart towards children and the inferior animals. But there also burned in him, like tongues of flame in a black pool of naphtha, a subtle and restless fire.
Everyone possesses Nat Turner because he fits into the role each creator wants to make him fit into. The amazing thing about Nat Turner is the fact that so little is known about him. We have those confessions and virtually nothing else. There are almost no accounts of what he was like seen through the eyes of anyone else, black or white. So this is, as I say, an astounding boon and a gift to anyone who wanted to use him as a metaphor, a symbol for anything having to do with slavery, with having to do with freedom, having to do with rebellion. He fits no mold and fits every mold all at once. And that's what has made him so intriguing to so many people over the years.
In the years leading up to the Civil War, Frederick Douglass and other black abolitionists repeatedly voiced admiration for Nat Turner and other slave rebels.
What Douglass said was that the Nat Turners were actually more legitimately the heirs of the American Revolution than the whites who celebrated July 4th every year in the 1840s and 50s, but owned slaves and deprived millions of Americans of their freedom.
Continuing in the tradition of Frederick Douglass, William Wells Brown, an abolitionist leader who had escaped from slavery, invoked an heroic image of Nat Turner in an essay written during the Civil War. In the midst of this essay, he imaginatively constructed the speech Turner might have delivered to his fellow conspirators at Cabin Pond.
Friends and brothers, we are to commence a great work tonight. Our race is to be delivered from slavery. And God has appointed us as the men to do his bidding. And let us be worthy of our calling.
We gloried in these heroes, as children will. Sometimes we would create among ourselves, we boys in particular, our own version of what Nat did and what we would have done if we'd have been old Nat, and how that would have satisfied us greatly.
While some African Americans invoked Nat Turner's name as a great black hero and liberator, most Southern whites continued to portray him as a fanatic and villain who attacked an essentially benevolent institution. This became the dominant white view throughout the nation during the late 19th and 20th centuries. Black folk memories of the rebellion surfaced in the WPA interviews of ex-slaves conducted during the 1930s. The WPA undertook the task of finding and questioning black residents of the South who had once been slaves. Sometimes the interviews produced memories that were obviously passed on by family members who lived at the time of Nat Turner's revolt. Sometimes these recollections explored the violence in Turner's insurrection. In 1937, the ex-slave Allen Crawford spoke about Nat Turner from stories he had heard growing up in Southampton County.
First place he got to was his mistress's house. Said God deigned him to start the first war with 40 men. Well, when he got to his mistress's house, he commenced to grab his missus's baby, and he slung him back and forth 3 times. Said it was hard for him to kill this baby, 'cause he had been so playful when he was sitting on his lap. So, third sling, he went quick about it, killing that baby.
The 1930s were a turbulent time in America. It was an era of segregation when the seeds of change were beginning to be sown. During this time of racial strife, artists, writers, and playwrights were inspired to tell the story of Nat Turner and his revolt, exploring the consequences of using violence to end oppression in his time and their own.
Bring the alarm bell!
In 1935, Black theater educator Randolph Edmonds presented the Nat Turner story as a play written to be performed at schools and colleges.
You killed him! You did it!
In the climactic scene, Edmonds turns his attention to the horrible consequences of the rebellion for the men and women of the slave community.
I was gonna tell the white folks where you is. I was gonna tell them, I say, you ain't nothing but a beast. That's what, a beast.
A beast? A beast? She called me a beast. If I'm a beast, who made me one? If they buy and sell me women like dogs and feed me their leavings, how can I be nothing else but a beast? just as dead. Hawk is captured and there ain't no army. What am I going to do now, Lord? What am I going to do? Look at that moon coming back to light up the world. It's big and round and yellow. It done dripped out all this blood. My hands is full of blood too. Will they ever be clean? Was I wrong, Lord, to fight that black men must be free? Show me a vision, Lord, like you did when the spirits were fighting in there. Talk to me, Holy Ghost. It must be the army looking about in the woods for me. I can't let them catch me. I've got to get me an army and fight some more for freedom. I want to be free. I must have freedom for all the black slaves. Show me how to get it, Lord. Spirit of God, show me the way. Guide me, lead me, lead me.
There certainly was a real Nat Turner who lived and died in Southampton County, Virginia in 1831. But the man who lived and died in numerous artistic portrayals since 1831 was recreated over and over again to fit the needs of each of his creators. The decade of the 1950s was a watershed in our nation's troubled history of race relations. During these years, the civil rights movement began a full-scale assault on the elaborate system of racial segregation in the South. The public was exposed repeatedly to images of violence during these years. It was in this atmosphere that a growing number of frustrated African Americans sought inspiration from Nat Turner and the 1831 Southampton Slave Revolt.
I never heard of Nat and wanted to know more about him and started just reading about him and what happened in Southampton County.
There was a debate going on among the young people in different civil rights organizations, the young people, about black consciousness and versus integration and what direction they should move in order to keep the movement going and to keep liberating black folks.
If you don't want any trouble, keep your filthy white hands off our beautiful black folks.
Nat symbolized revolt, symbolized resistance. He was a black man who refused to accept his condition. So we identified with that brother, and we saw him as a brother, and we saw a direct link. We knew exactly what he felt like, because we felt the same way, and we saw ourselves as continuing that struggle.
Usually the police wouldn't brutalize anyone if we were on hand because we were armed.
Revolution has come.
Nat Turner returned to the center of the national stage with the publication in 1967 of William Styron's The Confessions of Nat Turner. The novel was an instant bestseller and won the Pulitzer Prize.
It's hard to reconstruct the bland, ill-informed atmosphere of suburban white America in the 50s and 60s. And it came as a revelation to really almost a whole generation that they should even be thinking about these things.
It was through the Book of the Month Club that I got this novel called The Confessions of Nat Turner. I remember when it arrived, and I started reading it that evening after I got home from school, and I stayed up all night and I read it in one sitting.
My intention had been from the very beginning to try to present a multifaceted, complex overview of slavery as an institution which totally degraded a race of people, and that included such torment upon one of its more gifted sons, namely Nat Turner, that it indeed turned him into a half-crazed avenger. My book turned him into a far more heroic figure than the actual Nat Turner was, because I gave him human dimensions.
He didn't humanize Nat Turner for me, because I came to the novel with my own version of Nat Turner firmly established in my head. So, to whom did he humanize? To the white community? That might be possible, since the white community has always tended to look upon our rebels, as demons and as subhumans, as people who are attacking the bastions of white civilization.
When I was growing up, I was taught in American history books that Africa had no history, and neither did I. That I was a savage, about whom the less said the better, who had been saved by Europe and brought to America. And of course, I believed it. I didn't have much choice. Those are the only books there were. I am one of the people who built the country.
Jimmy Baldwin moved into my house here in Connecticut in the winter of 1960. By this time, I was boiling to write the book. And I think it was he who encouraged me more than anyone else to seize the idea of the first person and to plunge into that kind of narrative mode. Because he himself had already begun to deal with the idea of writing about white people from an intimate point of view. And he said that what you should do as a white writer is to be bold and take on the persona of a black man, Nat Turner.
William Styron gave his 20th century novel the same title as Thomas R. Gray's 1831 Confessions. Examining this document for clues about Nat Turner, Styron was fascinated by a particular passage.
Miss Margaret, when I discovered her, had concealed herself in the corner formed by the projection of the cellar cap from the house. On my approach, she fled, but was quickly overtaken, and after repeated blows with a sword, I killed her by a blow on the head with a fence rail.
Margaret was the only person killed by Nat Turner in the course of the rebellion. She was a young white woman. Styron takes this and makes a love affair out of it between Nat and Margaret. I think African Americans generally, and whites to some extent, resented the relationship that Styron created.
This was for a novelist the perfect question to ask. Why? Why did he do this? Wasn't there some relationship between the two of them? Now, we don't know anything about their relationship, but I was writing a novel. I wasn't writing a work of historiography, and I had a right to make a relationship between Nat and Margaret Whitehead a kind of centerpiece of the book.
Did I ever tell you about the mass that Charlotte Tyler and I wrote together?
The closeness, the stillness,
Wonderful.
the seclusion he created once more voluptuous stirring in my blood.
Christianity and pagan.
Her eyes met mine unflinchingly, not so much coquettish as insistent, inviting, daring, and almost expecting my gaze to repose in her own eyes while she prattled blissfully on. It was the longest encounter I could remember ever having with a white person's eyes.
Just grand.
I turned away, swept with lust again, hating her guts. Now driven close to distraction by that chattering monologue pitched at a girlish whisper, which I no longer bothered to listen to or understand.
Styron's attempt to imagine a relationship between Nat Turner and the teenaged Margaret Whitehead provoked a storm of protest from black critics.
Nat Turner is one of our great heroes, and we wanted him to be presented to our children in a way that preserved and protected our needs and our necessities. We need to say to our young girls, you're beautiful. You know, your hair's nappy, of course, your skin is black, but you're beautiful. And you're lovable and worthy of the respect of our young men. But how could we say that if our great hero, instead of affirming the beauty of black womanhood, went and affirmed the beauty of white womanhood?
When I got the information from the Book of the Month Club, just reading about the book made me so angry that I tore up the newsletter, flushed it down the toilet, and wrote a letter resigning from the Book of the Month Club in protest against them picking this book.
It got tremendous review. Everybody, all the critics loved it, you know. And this tells me a great deal about attitudes. They themselves have never come to grips with slavery, what it was about.
But not all reviewers lavished praise on the novel. A group known as the 10 Black Writers published a volume deeply critical of Styron's image of the slave rebel.
It's a book that made me particularly indignant because it was so disappointing. Because that final Nat Turner is going to get presented on the main stage of American culture, and instead of which we get this travesty.
I recall one of my former owners, Mr. Thomas Moore, once saying that Negroes never committed suicide. I recollect the exact situation. Hog-killing time in Moore's puckered, pockmarked face as he labored at the bloody carcass, and the exact words spoken to two neighbors as I stood by listening.
You ever heard of a nigger killing himself? No, I figured Docu, he might want to kill himself, but he gets to thinking about it, keep thinking about it, thinking, and pretty soon he's gone to sleep. Ain't that right, Nat?
Yes, sir, Master Tom. That's right. Sure enough. I had to admit to myself that I'd never known of a Negro who had killed himself, and in trying to explain this fact, I tended to believe that in the face of such adversity, it must be a Negro's Christian faith which swerved him away from the idea of self-destruction. But now, as I sit here amid the incessant murmur and the buzz of flies, I can no longer say that I feel this to be true. It seemed that rather my black shit-eating people were surely like flies, God's mindless outcast, lacking even that will to destroy by their own hand their unending anguish.
How would anybody seeking to organize his people to struggle for their own liberation have that perception of them? It was an act of arrogance coming out of a profound ignorance that led him to think he could restructure that experience in anything that would be a credible way, or a way that reflected anything that an informed black person would know of our own experience, to make it acceptable to black people.
Novels can be good, novels can be bad. But I think it's different to say that than to say you shouldn't have written this in the first place because you were white, or what are you doing to our history by creating this character about whom we feel deeply ambivalent. And believe me, I think that it was the sexuality of Nat Turner that bugged people the most, no matter how they justified it. I think that without that, the novel would have passed through without a peep.
It was perfect because it was set in the first century Rome.
The place where her breast had met my arm was like an incandescence, tingling. Again, I was smothered by remorseless desire. Insanely, I found myself measuring the risk. Take her here on this bank by this quiet brook. Forget your great mission. Abandon all for these hours of terror and bliss.
Oh, you should read some of my poetry sometime.
Being attracted to and repelled by members of the opposite sex strikes me as the most natural thing in the world. And to have left that out, to have rendered Turner incapable of that kind of internal struggle, would have reduced his humanity. I think Styron knew exactly what he was doing, and I think he did the right thing.
We have to deal, as black people, with so much of this kind of stuff, not so much in writing, but in our everyday lives.
What Styron had done was play at the worst fears of white America, and I think, frankly, fantasizing in his own mind as a white male about the lustful feelings that black men had for white women. I didn't want a white woman, and I didn't know any of my brothers who did. And he did, he said that Nat wanted one. And not only did he want one, that he was willing to kill for it. And not only that was his primary motivation. Liberation was irrelevant. It was sexual, unbridled sexual lust or something like that.
What really would have caused rage on the part of the black critics would have been, I think, if they had had a consummated sexual relationship, which would really have proved my own racism. But actually, the relationship between Nat Turner and Margaret Whitehead is infinitely more complicated. It's as much filled with rage and hatred on Nat's part than any kind of unrequited love.
Please kill me. Please, Nat.
Shut your eyes.
It hurts so.
He does at the end realize the horror of having killed this woman out of his rage. And I think that Nat Turner's feeling of love at the end is really an attempt to express his own sense of reconciliation and redemption, and has very little to do with any direct human connection. I think this is an abstraction. At least that's what I was attempting to do. It struck me as a great irony that I began to write Nat Turner the summer of Martin Luther King's great speech in Washington. And it was a time of reconciliation, of nonviolence, of peacefulness, a sense that blacks and whites could work this thing out together. But by the time I finished the novel, in 1967, this sweetness and light that Martin Luther King was predicting had turned into a kind of hellish nightmare on the racial scene. And so Nat Turner appeared, my Nat Turner, appeared at a time when this dream of Martin Luther King's had evaporated. So there was good reason why my book was met with such mixed reactions.
I do think that in an extraordinary and strange way, Bill Styron did do a service in the sense of putting Nat Turner back on the table, making people argue about who he was. And nobody, no matter which side they took of the argument, really knew very much. It was like people throwing punches in the dark. And in the last generation since then, we've learned a lot more, though we still have not penetrated the veil entirely.
We can't be dependent on white people to represent our culture with integrity and imagination and respect.
If you don't like Bill Styron's Nat Turner, write your own. I think the only way that you can fight a representation in art that you don't like is to create new art, create more art, surround it.
I don't consider myself an artist. I don't consider myself as one who can critique art. I only paint for one reason and one reason only, and that is to illustrate what is said to me through my ancestors. They're not asking for revenge, they're asking to be recognized. And I believe they will not rest in peace unless their story is heard, unless their voices are heard.
But can any work of art move Americans closer to an agreement on the meaning of Nat Turner and his revolt?
Shopping with Google helps you find whatever you're looking for, like patio furniture for hanging with your bestie. You can find the best value, read reviews, even see what's available nearby. Your best shopping starts with Google.
Sally!
Cut it. Swinged in wood too other time.
One more time, right away. Here we go. Ready.
I think there is a need for closure. There is a need to resolve this thing. Sometimes it takes a mediator, a piece of artwork can do that. The whole idea is, who is Nat Turner? We don't know. And people with little information have created their own Nat, and they've claimed it.
Things like that.
And it's not that we're trying to reclaim Nat. We're just trying to present other artists' interpretation of Nat Turner, and trying to do that very faithfully without interpreting their work.
Was a wrong law to fight that black men must be free?
Everywhere in the film, there is interpretation, and the subject matter we are dealing with is interpretation. Now, when you do a film about interpretation, what's the film about that interpretation? Isn't that film another interpretation?
We're really unconscious of the pain that you're causing this little kid.
Mark.
And so that's the sinister part about this scene.
Whatever. Every interpretation ultimately forces you back into another interpretation, another interpretation, another interpretation.
Action.
Reverend Ballard, more wine.
That's the tension here, is to say that, no, you're not doing your movie about Nat Turner. You're doing William Styron's interpretation of Nat Turner as faithful as possible to William Styron's scenes in his novel.
Right, but I can't cut it.
Same thing with Thomas R. Gray. You're trying to be matter-of-fact about Thomas R. Gray. You're not trying to take any kind of license. Recreate these different sources of Nat Turner, the publications and things like that. We can't say in this film that this person is wrong and that person is wrong. It's not about that. The truth is that this event happened, people interpreted it a certain way on racial lines, and the only way to resolve it or to live with it is to have some sort of dialogue and come to terms with what was this event.
Rolling.
Mark.
Shh, quiet. Action.
Cut.
Cutting.
I think there's a great danger of sliding into a kind of relativism. And there are multiple different versions of history, and let's just line them all up. And I think that the great challenge would be how to devise a structure that permits some degree of interpretation and reflection on multiple perspectives without implying there was no truth of the matter.
The fact is there was a historical Nat Turner. The fact is that certain things were known about him. The fact is that as a consequence of his actions, he occupied a very prominent and important role in the collective memory and imagination of the black community.